All right, good morning. We are back again with Matthew. We are on chapter 2. Let's see, where do we want to begin? Verse 1?
I think we should start.
We should start at verse 1. All right. I'm leaning forward because my phone's really far away. It says in verse 1, chapter 2, it says, Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, in verse 2, saying, Where is he that is born of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and we have come to worship him. Now, do you have prophecies or not?
You want to talk about the Magi first?
I like the Magi. I like the wise men. I have not found it anywhere. I have not found a scholar or a preacher that agrees with me necessarily in writing. But I personally, because I used to teach Daniel, the book of Daniel too, and the prophecies in Daniel. And in Daniel chapter 9, he specifically says when the Messiah is coming. He gives them a timeline. He tells them exactly when he's coming. So they're gonna know that when he's supposed to show up. And keep in mind, he was in Babylonian captivity to the east of Jerusalem. It was to the east. And Daniel was not only a wise man, he was the chief of the wise men eventually. As he grew up in Babylon, he became a chief of the wise men. And these are the type of wise men that they're talking about. Now, whether they came actually from the Babylonian area or if they came from further east, I really can't tell you. They don't say. But they reference them as wise men, scholars, is what it was one way of saying it. Scholars, they were educated men.
Well, and Daniel was trusted by Nebuchadnezzar. Not at first; he was in prison, but he gained his trust because God spoke to him, and the words that he gave Nebuchadnezzar were
interpret dreams.
True. They happened. He was proved who he was, and he proved who God was.
So roughly 450-ish years, more than that actually, between 450 and 480 years prior to this, Daniel said, look for him at this time. He wrote it down. Well, he's not the one that said it. Gabriel is the one that said it. But Daniel wrote it down in chapter 9, and it's part of his 70 weeks prophecy. And those 70 weeks, they're not talking about weeks of days. It's 77s, 70 weeks of years. And at the end of the 69th, in the 69th week or 69th week of years, the Messiah was to be there, and he was to be cut off at the end of the 69th week. In other words, he'd be killed. So they knew the time period of when he should show up.
And they knew where, they knew within an area where he was to be. They knew it was near Jerusalem because of Daniel telling them that Jerusalem would be rebuilt. They would be the people would be back in Jerusalem.
And so the Magi knew this. The Magi, the wise men, they knew where to go, and they followed when they saw. So they were looking at this time period. They always looked at the stars for signs, but they knew when they saw a sign from the east, when they saw a star that they had never seen before, something bright in the sky that they'd never seen. They saw it as a sign that Daniel's prophecy had come true.
And the part of the prophecy that we're talking about with the Magi is where they said, and he's going to read the last part of the chapter, or the last part, the verse 5, I believe it is.
Verse 5.
5 or 6.
Well, when he calls to the scribes, Herod called the scribes together. Yes. Herod, when the wise men showed up, Herod called to his scribes and said, "Where is he? Where is the king? Where is the Messiah to be born? Where is the born King of the Jews to be?" And the scribes, without hesitation, told him Bethlehem. They knew where he was supposed to be born because was it Micah?
Well, I'm going to read those.
Okay, she has the prophecies written down that was told to them, but they knew where he was supposed to be. So they said, in verse 5 it said, "And they said unto him, Bethlehem of Judea, for thus is written the prophet." And in verse 6, they reference, if you read it, they reference what she has, the prophecy.
The prophecy that they reference is Micah 5, verse 2. "But thou, Bethlehem Ephrath, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall come forth unto me that he come forth excuse me, that he shall come forth unto me that is to be the ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from old, from everlasting. And then in Psalm 72, verses 10 and 11, it references the Magi. It's in verse 10, it says, the kings of Tarsus and of the isles shall bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba shall offer gifts. Yea, all kings shall fall down before him. All nations shall serve him. The importance with, he was talking about the star, and he was talking about the Magi, and we were talking about they were back in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was rebuilt. All of that is historical. It is truthful. It is found in other records. God foretold with Daniel what was going to happen and the time frame it was going to happen. And I want to emphasize that Matthew, remember we said Matthew had been a tax collector, so he was not well received when he's talking to the scribes and Pharisees and the people of Israel and saying, this is what we were told would happen. But they could not find fault in what he said, because historically it happened. Yeah.
And one of my things about the scribes that I scribbled down here was that Jesus called the scribes and the Pharisees hypocrites. And the reason he called them hypocrites is because they could tell what season it was, and they could tell whether the storms were coming or, what kind of weather was going to happen by the signs in the sky, but they could not discern, but they claimed that they could not discern the time period that they were living in. They knew exactly who he was. They knew, because they knew they see, we have the promise of Christ coming back, of the Savior coming back, but we don't know when. There's signs and there's things that we know we're in the right time frame.
Yes.
But we don't know exactly when. The Jews didn't have this.
He told us not to focus on when. We need to we have a task to do now.
Right. And that's true. But they were told exactly when. They were told when and where. They knew. And so he called them hypocrites because they knew and were denying it.
And you have to wonder, we don't have to wonder. We know that they had polluted God's word so much and set themselves above. But the people of Israel were looking for that hope, and they were open to that hope.
Yeah. Now keep in mind, these scribes that Herod called, they didn't join the wise men and go with them to go worship the king. They told him where it was. They knew they were right, and they knew that the King of the Jews, the Messiah, had just been born. They were very aware of it, and the wise men went alone. Keep that. I mean, that does not speak well of these scribes at this time, or it speaks of their great fear of Herod.
Right.
He was a crazy man.
He was. They did go. The other thing we talked about, they were not traveling alone. They were traveling with an entourage.
Let's be clear. There's not three wise men. There's three gifts. There's not three wise men.
Yes, they were probably rulers themselves.
They were rulers. They were at least well educated, and they were at least what we call officers of the court. They would have definitely been that because they had access to Herod. Yes. You don't get that. You don't get access to the king easily.
So, but more than likely, the few of them, the rest of the entourage may have stayed outside of Jerusalem or somewhere in Jerusalem. They went to where they found Jesus.
That's right.
And they brought the gifts, but the gifts are important.
There were gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold is typically recognizing royalty. It's a king. He's recognized as the king. That's what the gold represents. Frankincense.
I also want to stop him real quickly. They more than likely were given enough gold that when they had to leave Jerusalem, it would have taken care of them. These
are gifts. They came a long way. If you ever watch the old movies where you got the king setting and the entourage comes in of the visiting dignitaries and they bring in their gifts, they don't bring a couple of pieces of gold. They bring a box full of gold.
Yes.
They aren't playing around. They're visiting a king that was prophesied about 400 and some odd years ago. They brought some gold. And they weren't playing. They weren't just bringing a little box like we show in the manger scene. That's not what happened. They had people carrying it in, and they brought it in and put it down. And they brought in the frankincense, which has to do with him being a priest. The priest used the frankincense in the temple, It was a very valuable spice. It was very expensive. And whether they used it themselves or not wouldn't matter. They could have sold it. Joseph and Mary could have sold it and used that for money as well. They were set up for a little while, maybe a great while. And then you got the myrrh, which was actually a perfume used in burial. It was a common commodity. It was fairly cheap, but because they used it all the time for burials, it was something they had. But it also signified that he was a sacrifice. He was going to die.
So we have the king.
Which was also prophesied in Daniel's. They knew that he was going to die. He was born to die.
But we have the king, we have the priest, and we have the sacrifice.
That's
all
right.
in one.
All in one. And while the scribes stayed in Jerusalem and didn't come worship him, the wise men from the east, the Gentiles, if you will, came and worshipped him. And just as Psalm said, all of the kings, all of the nations will bow down eventually. These were just the first.
They believed in God's word. They believed what Daniel told them was true, and they passed it down. Well, and each generation accepted that truth and was watching and preparing for that truth.
Well, they said, if you look at what Daniel prophesied about this, they would have no reason to doubt him.
No,
because in the same time period, Daniel he was in Babylon, and so he started there with the kingdom of Babylon. He told them the next was Persia. And the next was Greece. And the next was Rome. And now you got the Israelites living in Rome, under Roman rule. So they could follow. This is historical stuff. And they could follow the records. They were aware that Daniel predicted all of it. And he was right. Why wouldn't he be right about this?
So we're going to kind of condense a little bit to get to the next prophecy. The Magi listened to God in a dream, and they did not go back to Herod as he asked.
Right.
And they left and went another way, which angered Herod. Because
it angered Herod.
He expected to find out who the king was, but he didn't find out. And he will talk about what Herod's craziness was. But Joseph also was given a dream, and he listened to the dream.
Right.
And in that dream, he was told to take the mother and child and go to Egypt. But before we get to the next prophecy reading, he's going to talk about Herod.
Herod the Great. He was called Herod the Great, not because he was a good guy, because he did a lot of building. He built a lot of great things, architecture type things. And even the seventh wonder of the world or something like that. Herod's hanging gardens. There's that's the kind of stuff he built. But he went nuts when he didn't find out when they didn't come back. But he had already inquired of them of when they first saw the star. It was 2 years ago. And so it had to have been, so Jesus had to be no older than 2. So Herod went to Bethlehem and killed every child that was 2 years old and younger.
And some say it was every male child, but most refers to
my
every
scripture
child.
says children.
Yeah.
My children said all the children. He killed them all. Herod was nuts.
Backing up just a little bit to the star. We talked about this, and this is another thing that historically can be verified, that there was a supernova around that time.
That would have been visible over Israel from the east.
And what was it? How did you say it? You said that would have happened. How had to have started?
In order to get a supernova like that, because you understand the vast distances, even the light from our sun, the light from our star takes like 8 minutes to get to us. That's how far away it is. The light there takes like 8 minutes to get away. So in order for the supernova to appear as a star in the sky, a bright star in the sky, from that distance, it would have taken thousands of years to get there. So Jesus's birth, God set a supernova in place before he ever created man on the planet. He had this so planned out. As John said, it was from the foundation of the world. He already knew when, not only that Jesus was going to have to come sacrifice, he knew when. So he had already set a supernova in place to explode so they could see it. Now, whether it was a supernova, but I like the supernova theory because of that. It's a nice story. It also could have been the 3 or 4 planets came into alignment around that, give or take a few years, they came in alignment there too. Or it could have been simply an angel.
But in all three of those possibilities, it still took
incredible planning.
Well, it's something outside of this planet, outside of ourselves. A higher intelligence that set things in motion.
There was a reason why the wise men paid attention to it. It was huge.
To give the signs.
This was a major sign, and they had to pay attention to it because
yes.
But and they go to Egypt, and because Herod kills them all. Well, they don't stay in Egypt very long.
Okay, now he's going to reference in Matthew the verse that refers to the Egypt.
Which one was that?
Did you find it? Out of Egypt?
And he departed, behold, the angel came. Okay. He rose and took the child. What was it, verse 15? Mm-hmm. Yeah, verse 15. It says, and departed into Egypt and was there until the death of Herod. And a little side note, if you ever want to see karma in action, go look up how Herod died after he killed those children. It's not good.
God takes care of those who kill children.
Yeah, don't hurt children. It's not good. That it might be, anyway, back to Herod, after the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, out of Egypt have I called my son.
And so that is reference to Hosea 11:1. When Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt.
I wanted to, we discussed something. I never really noticed it when I was doing it before, but we were discussing the order of the prophecies and that they came unpacked. And she was saying, well, the prophecy of Egypt came first as opposed to him killing the children in Bethlehem. And I said, no, he had to kill the children of Bethlehem while they were gone to Egypt. They hadn't come back yet. And so I reread it, and she was right. That he referenced them coming back from Egypt after Herod died before he mentioned what Herod did. And what it meant to me was that Matthew wasn't necessarily telling a chronological story here. He's pointing out prophecies.
Correct.
He's making a point. He is a Jew talking to Jews, pointing out prophecies that they know exist, pointing them out that this is the Messiah.
And we really want you to be able to know and have a better knowledge of where it goes back from the Old Testament.
Absolutely.
Because
Matthew links the two.
What happened, what the prophets had to say in the Old Testament, the Jewish people did not question.
That's right. They're
looking for that. But we're saying that we have it. We have it in Jesus.
That's right. They're still looking for something that already happened.
So now we'll go back a little bit and talk about the killing of the children.
Yeah, because we said Herod went crazy. He's a nut. He went and killed all the children in Bethlehem 2 years and younger. And in verse 17 it says, and that was done, that it be fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet.
Jeremiah 31:15. Thou saith the Lord, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel weeping for her children, refused to be comforted for her children because they were not.
Now remember, Rachel was the wife of Jacob.
She was supposed to be the first wife, but ended up being the second.
Right. And she was the younger sister. And her older sister already had children. And she wasn't having any children. She appeared to be barren.
Yes.
And she went to God and she pleaded with God. She said, give me children or I die. For Joseph.
Yes.
And then he gave her another son, Benjamin. But Benjamin killed her. Not deliberately. She died in childbirth. She died giving Benjamin. Now... Benjamin and Judah, their lands are right up next to each other. Benjamin and Judah are right up next to it. And Bethlehem is, depending on what map you look at, sometimes it's well into Judah, sometimes. But there is a map and there is recordings in the scripture, I think it's more accurate to say that Bethlehem was right on the border between Judah and Bethlehem. I mean, Judah and Benjamin. Bethlehem's right there. And Bethlehem, Rachel's grave is literally within rock throwing distance. You can stand in Bethlehem and see Rachel's tomb. It's still there. And people still, the women of Israel still go there. and they still go there, and they go there for two specific reasons. The main one is to plead for children. They go there and they plead with God for children. Not to Rachel. Rachel can't help them. But they go there in the spirit of Rachel. And plead and with the same spirit that Rachel had and plead with God for children. Or they go there and other people go there and pray for these pregnant women that they ease of childbirth and so that they don't die like Rachel did. And so Rachel is right there. She pleaded for these children, and now Herod has killed her children. And so she is distraught, as Jeremiah said, and she weeps for her children.
And they would know, knowing the story with Rachel, when she died,
they would understand this.
They were going to give him the plot of land. He said, no, I will buy it. I will own it. It was Rachel's land. It was her legacy. And Benjamin was her son and her legacy.
Yep. And now Herod had killed who knows how many of her children, because he thought because he knew a king was born, and it's a horrible, horrible story. At least that part of it, and it says, what are we at? 19 now. 19, and it said, when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, arise and take the young child and his mother, and go into the land of Israel, for they are dead which sought the young child's life. And so now we get the prophecy where he's coming back out of Egypt. He doesn't go back to Bethlehem, though. I think that may have been his intention, going back to Bethlehem. I don't know how long they were gone. Their house may still be there. Anyway, he was going back towards that direction until he heard that which one of Herod's sons was in charge of the Judean area.
Which says, but when he heard that Archelaus did reign in Judah in the room of his father Herod, he was afraid to go thither. Notwithstanding, being warned of God in a dream, he turned aside into parts of Galilee. Archelaus was even more brutal than Herod,
which is also you can look up historically if you choose to. He was horrible. He was vicious to the Israelite people, and I believe so. He didn't want to be there, and it's very possible that if Archelaus had realized that Joseph and Mary had came back, he'd have killed Jesus himself,
probably,
or tried to.
Attempted.
And so the angel guided him away from there, and they went to Galilee. By the way, Galilee is like the backwater of Israel at this time. I don't know if it's still considered that way or not. Now it's a very popular tourist place because that's where Jesus came from. So it's raised its prominence has raised.
Yes.
And the city of Nazareth is raised. But at the time, Nazareth was the serious backwater. It's the ghettos. Yeah.
Where things are
nothing good comes from there. Nathan, in fact, Nathan asked, what was that? Nathan asked, does anything good come from Nazareth?
And we will get to that, but I want him to speak Joseph.
Joseph, yeah. I like Joseph. The Bible, and the reason we were talking about it is because I know everything I need to know about Joseph. Because the Bible speaks very little about Joseph. There's very little actual facts and figures and stuff like that people love to grasp onto about Joseph. But here's one thing that you really need to understand about Joseph. Out of all of the men that was ever on this planet, or was ever came before him or ever came after him, Joseph was chosen by God to show Jesus how to be a man. That's all I need to know. He was a just man. He was a righteous man. He was a godly man. And he was a provider for his family. He was a good husband, and he was a good father because he's the one God chose.
Well, and you said something that rang with me.
I said Joseph was, you can look at him as a stepfather or as an adoptive father. He was a stepfather. This child was not his. And he knew it, but it didn't matter. He raised him. He took him into his home and he raised him as his own, and he loved him. And we know that because God chose him. We know what kind of a man Joseph would have had to have been. And that rang with me because there are so many step parents and adoptive parents that are treated like they're less than, and that's not the case. They are more than. I mean, I love my children to death, but they were mine. I created them. I chose to have them. They were my fault. And so they were my responsibility, and I raised them. But I didn't look at them as a responsibility. I loved them. but they were my choice. Step parents, that was not their choice necessarily. They did not They did not wake up one day and go, well, okay, I want to have children. No, they came in. They fell in love with them when they already existed, and they couldn't have loved them more. But a good step parent and a good adoptive parent, because adoptive parents are just something else. They just chose to raise somebody else's children. You know, they stepped in and said, I'll be the parent that you don't have. That's impressive to me. I don't think I have that in me. I honestly don't. I barely kept from killing my own children. So I don't understand.
Well, and being
if you know me, you know that.
Being a step parent.
Yeah, and Ro is a step parent.
Are there. You don't take that love away. You add to.
That's right. And I've seen her stepchildren, the way they act her and the way they talk to her and the way she's part of their life. It reminds me of Joseph, to be honest. Joseph really rings true to me because he's every bit of the man that everybody should try to be.
Amen.
Yeah. So.
But he was talking about Bethlehem and read the last part of chapter 2.
The last verse? Or the last two?
Last part of, yeah.
And it said, and he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophets, notice plural, spoken of by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene.
When I was looking at verses, there wasn't, some of the verses that some of my study directed me to didn't really speak to this. We did find some verses that do reference this. One is Isaiah 49:7. Thus saith the Lord, the Redeemer of Israel and his Holy One, to him whom man despiseth, to him whom the nation abhorreth, to a servant of rulers, kings shall see and arise.
Mm-hmm.
Princes shall also worship, because of the Lord that is faithful and the Holy One of Israel. He shall come choose thee. And then Isaiah 53:3. He is despised and rejected of man, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hide as it were our faces from him. As he was despised, and we esteem him not. And remember when they were parading him to crucify him, people turned away. They turned their faces, or they mocked him and threw things at him. In Micah 5:1 it says, "Now gather thyself in troops, O daughter of troops. He hath laid siege against us. They shall smite the judge of Israel with the rod upon the cheek." And remember, he was beaten and he was hit, and he was hit with a rod, and he was hit many places, and body torn, and crown of thorns put on his head, and just blood just everywhere. One description looked like somebody was trying to pound meat. And then when you get to John, this is really where it refers to Bethlehem a little more. Nazareth. I'm sorry. John 1:46. And Nathanael said to him, "Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" And Philip said to him, "Come and see." I want to go read a little bit from Daniel.
I wanted to explain some of Nazareth. Yeah. When I was a kid, I used to, and growing up, I heard people, confuse that saying that he was a Nazarene or from Nazareth as with a Nazarite. A Nazarite is someone who takes an oath. They don't cut their hair. They don't drink alcohol. They stay away from the dead. They for either for their life or normally for a shorter period of time, like 30 days. It's more along the lines of fasting. There's only 3 that I think are recorded that were supposed to be Nazarites for life. And you got Samson, who didn't quite follow it exactly. That's why he got in trouble. Samson. You got Samuel, the prophet Samuel, and you got John the Baptist. These were Nazarites. Jesus was a Nazarene. He came, which just simply means that he came from Nazareth. I'm a Lamarite. I came from Lamar. That kind of thing. It was But in that time period, to say you were a Nazarene, that's why those scriptures were saying he was despised. If you were called a Nazarene, you were being listed as someone that was despised, someone that was less than, someone that was could be thrown away. Now, why did Joseph choose to go to Nazareth? Why did the angel guide him into this area? Because it'd be the last place you'd look for a king, and so that's not where they would have looked for.
But I also believe that God wanted to make sure that his king, his choice, wasn't what everybody else would choose.
That's right.
He chooses each one of us, not because we earn it or deserve it or have a special place in this world, but we do have a special place for God.
That's right.
But I want to read some of Daniel that helps you understand where the Magi would have gotten their information. It's in chapter 9 and starts with verse 24 through 27. It said, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins and to make reconciliation for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Verse 25, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in tumultuous times. And I'm going to stop there because he's going to explain a little bit.
If you look at it as 7, as of sevenths instead of weeks, we think of weeks in days because there's 7 days. Well, this is 7 years. It's reference to years, so you got 7 weeks of years. And from the time the command went to rebuild the temple or rebuild Jerusalem, I think it was Darius. I'm not sure.
Yes, it was Darius.
King Darius. And whose name? What was it in H? Hezekiah? No, it wasn't Hezekiah.
It was in.
Oh, Nehemiah. If you go back and read the book of Nehemiah, you find out the command came forth and he went through and they came to build and they built the temple. They were building the temple. They built it part way and didn't quite finish and he had to yell at them. But anyway, and they built it and then they built the walls and they built the walls either under time of war. They weren't supposed to have walls. They were a defeated people. They were a conquered people. But they built the wall anyway. And they built the wall with one, you had a hammer in one hand and a sword in the other because you were building a wall during a time of war. You were trying to defend yourself while they were there to attack you. But it took, and it said 7, there'd be 7 sevens.
7 weeks, 62 weeks.
Yes. The 7 weeks is 7 sevens of years, and that's 49 years. From the time they were told to start to the time they got the walls built, 49 years. And Jerusalem knew that. The Israelites knew this. It took 49 years. And then there's 62 after that. 60 is 60. A score is 20 years. So you got, a score is 20, and in this case years. So you got 62 more weeks of sevens. 60 more weeks of years. So it's 69 weeks of years. 69 out of the 70. At 69, the Messiah is cut off. And so they knew the time period. That's what I'm saying.
And so that's verse 26. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself.
For us.
And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm. You want me to stop there?
Well, I was going to say the Roman army came in and took the temple down stone by stone. There was nothing left. They took it down. All that's left is what they call now the West Wailing Wall.
Yeah.
The only thing left now is the wall to the outer court. The temple itself was completely taken apart, piece by piece.
That's the flood they're talking about. The flood
of
the soldiers that
flood
came
of the
in.
Roman army. Yeah.
They were not going to let them have something that was going to give them strength
and the
unity.
people were scattered. I think it talks about that.
Yes.
The people of Israel were scattered.
Verse 27, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that the determined shall be poured upon the desolate.
That last verse is speaking of, I believe, the 70th week. That I personally believe, and there are scholars that disagree with me, and there are scholars that do agree with me. That 70th week has not happened yet. John spoke about it in Revelation, because Jesus said that when you see the abomination that spoke of Daniel, when the abomination of desolation is set up in the temple, as spoken of by Daniel, run to the hills, run, because the worst is to come, and that is the last. And John, in his Revelation, speaks of that at 3.5 years in, that's when that's going to happen. 3.5 years into the 7 weeks, 7 years of tribulation. So I believe that 70th week is still coming, because Israel still has 1 week to do to them.
But Daniel wasn't given the whole revelation, and what Daniel taught was what he knew, and he taught of the Messiah. The rest of that is to come, and Matthew reminds us that, takes us back to Daniel, so that we know that the Magi, what they knew and what Daniel taught them, is what they believed and what they followed, and it was historical.
Okay, that's chapter 2.
We're done.
All right. Well, next time we'll see what's in store in chapter 3 for our young king. All right.